Welcome back to another year in gaming video. Today, we're taking a trip back to 1994, a year packed with unforgettable moments in entertainment, culture, and one of the greatest years in gaming history. 1994 was a year the world couldn't look away from. Millions of Americans were glued to their TVs watching the infamous white Bronco chase involving O.J. Simpson. At the same time, the music world was shaken by the tragic death of Kurt Cobain. Out west, Los Angeles was hit by a devastating earthquake, while Woodstock '94 brought music fans together for a massive three-day celebration. At the box office, 1994 was absolutely stacked. Films like Forrest Gump, The Lion King, Pulp Fiction, True Lies, Speed, Dumb and Dumber, The Crow, and Interview with the Vampire dominated theaters and defined a generation of cinema. Television was just as iconic. NBC launched two massive hits with Friends and ER, while Fox brought comic book fans Spider-Man, the animated series. Other shows like New York Undercover, Touched by an Angel, and Chicago Hope made their debut, while Star Trek: The Next Generation aired its legendary series finale. Music in 1994 was everywhere. Hits like I Swear by All For One, The Sign by Ace of Base, All I Wanna Do by Sheryl Crow, Buddy Holly by Weezer, Cream by Wu-Tang Clan, Creep by TLC, Stay by Lisa Loeb, Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden, and Can You Feel the Love Tonight by Elton John. Hip-hop reached a new level with two all-time great debut albums, Illmatic by Nas and Ready to Die by the Notorious B.I.G. In sports, the Dallas Cowboys defeated the Buffalo Bills in Super Bowl 28, winning their second straight championship. The New York Rangers ended a 40-year drought by winning the Stanley Cup. But the year also saw major disruption, as the Major League Baseball strike canceled the World Series for the first time in 90 years. Meanwhile, in wrestling, Hulk Hogan shocked the world by jumping to World Championship Wrestling and defeating Ric Flair to win the WCW World Heavyweight Championship at Bash at the Beach. But while all of this was happening, something even bigger was brewing. 1994 would go down as one of the most important years in video game history. A new challenger entered the arena. Sony revealed its upcoming console, the PlayStation, preparing to shake up the entire industry. At the same time, the console wars between Nintendo and Sega were at their peak. Nintendo brought back a legendary character after more than a decade, while Sega pushed forward with one of its biggest franchises. And for the first time, one of gaming's biggest fighting franchises made the leap to Hollywood with Street Fighter hitting the big screen. So with all that said, let's dive into the games, the innovation, and the moments that made 1994 one of the greatest years in gaming history. 1. The birth of PlayStation. Before PlayStation became a global powerhouse, it actually started with a failed partnership. Back in 1991, Nintendo teamed up with Sony to create a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. But in a shocking move, Nintendo backed out of the deal and instead partnered with Philips. That decision didn't just end a partnership, it created a rival. Sony, determined to prove itself, announced it would enter the video game industry on its own. And just a few years later, in 1994, that vision became reality. Sony officially launched the PlayStation in Japan on December 3, 1994. This wasn't just another console, it was a major leap forward. The PlayStation focused heavily on 3D gaming, delivering more advanced graphics, improved sound, and a new kind of immersive experience that players hadn't really seen before. And right out of the gate, it was a success. The PlayStation sold millions of units in Japan, quickly establishing itself as a serious contender in the market. Sony had arrived, and they weren't going anywhere. But while Japan was impressed, the real test was still ahead. North America, that would be the true battleground the following year. Still, this moment marked the beginning of something massive, the rise of PlayStation, a brand that would go on to reshape the gaming industry forever. 2. Sega's risky move. Before Sony could fully take over the spotlight, Sega made the first move into the next generation. On November 22, 1994, Sega launched the Sega Saturn in Japan, beating Sony to market by just a couple of weeks. On paper, this looked like a huge win. The Saturn was a 32-bit console, priced at 44,800 yen, about $440 at the time, and it launched with a strong lineup of games that impressed early players in Japan. Sega was aiming to carry its momentum from the 16-bit era straight into the future. But things didn't go exactly as planned. While the Saturn had solid hardware, it was also complicated, especially when it came to developing games. And as the industry began shifting toward true 3D gaming, Sega started to lose its edge. Meanwhile, the PlayStation was right around the corner, and it was built specifically for that 3D future. What started as a head start for Sega quickly turned into a struggle. Because as we now know, the Saturn wouldn't become the leap forward Sega hoped for, it would become the beginning of their downfall in the console market. Sony was coming, and they were ready to take over. 2. Sega vs. Nintendo, the 16-bit war continues. While Sony and Sega were launching next-generation consoles in Japan, the real battle in North America was still being fought on 16-bit hardware. The console war wasn't over, not even close. In 1993, the Sega Genesis had taken the crown, becoming the #1 selling console and giving Sega a massive victory over Nintendo. For the first time, Nintendo had been knocked off the top. But 1994 told a different story. Nintendo came back swinging with a bold and aggressive strategy, the "Play It Loud" campaign. These weren't the bright, family-friendly ads people were used to. They were louder, edgier, and aimed at an older audience. Because Nintendo realized something crucial: video games were no longer just for kids. The audience was growing up, and Nintendo needed to grow with it. At the same time, major releases like Mortal Kombat 2 on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, now fully uncensored, helped shift perception and bring older players back to Nintendo's side. And it worked. By the end of 1994, the Super Nintendo had reclaimed its spot as the top-selling console, powered by a strong lineup of games and a new, more mature image. Nintendo had taken the crown back. But this victory came at a turning point. Because even as the 16-bit war raged on, it was slowly coming to an end. Both Sega, Nintendo, and newcomer Sony were already preparing for the next generation, and a brand new console war was beginning. 4. Donkey Kong is back. While 1994 didn't see a brand new Mario or Zelda title, Nintendo had something else in mind. They brought back a legend. After 13 years, Donkey Kong made his big return, and it changed everything. In 1994, Nintendo released Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and it quickly became their biggest game of the year. Developed by Rare using cutting-edge technology from Silicon Graphics, the game featured pre-rendered 3D models that gave it a look unlike anything else on a 16-bit console. In the game, Donkey Kong teams up with his nephew Diddy Kong to take on the villainous King K. Rool and the Kremlings, delivering tight platforming, memorable music, and groundbreaking visuals. At the time, many players actually believed this was a preview of Nintendo's next console. But it wasn't. It was running on the Super Nintendo. And that was the shocking part. Nintendo had managed to push a 16-bit system to its absolute limits, delivering what looked like a next-generation experience on existing hardware, something that seemed impossible at the time. The result? Donkey Kong Country became the best-selling game of 1994 and a massive win for Nintendo in the middle of the console wars. Donkey Kong was officially back, and bigger than ever. But Sega wasn't going to sit back and watch. Because they had a sequel of their own, and it was fast. 5. Sonic Strikes Back. But while Nintendo was dominating with Donkey Kong, Sega wasn't about to back down. They fired back with their biggest weapon, Sonic the Hedgehog. In 1994, Sega released Sonic the Hedgehog 3 for the Sega Genesis, one of the most ambitious platformers of the 16-bit era. This wasn't just another sequel. It was bigger, faster, and more advanced than anything Sonic had done before. The game introduced new mechanics, larger levels, and even save functionality, something that was still rare at the time for platformers. Players could control both Sonic and Tails, adding more variety to the gameplay. And then, there was a new rival. Knuckles the Echidna made his debut, starting off as an enemy before becoming one of the most iconic characters in the franchise. But Sega didn't stop there. In a bold and unusual move, Sonic the Hedgehog 3 was later connected to Sonic and Knuckles, allowing players to combine the two games into one larger experience, something completely unique at the time. It was Sega pushing innovation, trying to stay one step ahead. And while Donkey Kong Country was showing off graphical power, Sonic 3 proved that speed, gameplay, and style still mattered. The rivalry between Nintendo and Sega had reached its peak. Two massive games, two different visions, one unforgettable year, and the battle for gaming supremacy was far from over. 6. Samus returns in Super Metroid. While Nintendo was delivering massive hits in 1994, another legendary hero made her return. Samus Aran. That year, Nintendo released Super Metroid for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the first Metroid game on a 16-bit console. And it wasn't just a sequel, it was a masterpiece. In Super Metroid, Samus travels to the planet Zebes to recover an infant Metroid that has been stolen by the space pirate leader Ridley. The game built upon everything that made the original Metroid great: exploration, atmosphere, and isolation, and refined it into a near-perfect experience. Its 2D side-scrolling gameplay combined action and adventure in a way that felt deeper and more immersive than ever before. It also pushed the Super Nintendo to its limits, delivering incredible sound design, smooth controls, and a world that felt alive and connected. For many players, Super Metroid wasn't just one of the best games of 1994. It was one of the greatest games of all time. It became one of the top-selling titles on the Super Nintendo that year and helped define what the system was capable of. But interestingly, it would also mark the end of an era. After Super Metroid, the series would go quiet for years, until it made a major comeback with Metroid Prime nearly a decade later. Still, Super Metroid remains a defining moment, not just for the franchise, but for gaming as a whole. A perfect blend of atmosphere, gameplay, and innovation that proved once again why 1994 was such a special year. 7. Final Fantasy VI, a JRPG masterpiece. While Nintendo dominated action and platformers, 1994 was also a landmark year for RPG fans. Final Fantasy VI, released as Final Fantasy III in North America at the time, hit the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, delivering one of the deepest, most ambitious role-playing games of the era. This wasn't just another fantasy story. Final Fantasy VI introduced a sprawling cast of characters, each with their own motivations and struggles, and a narrative that tackled themes of loss, rebellion, and redemption, something rare for games at the time. The game's villain, Kefka Palazzo, became one of the most memorable antagonists in gaming history, thanks to his chaotic personality and shocking actions that left players stunned. On the technical side, Final Fantasy VI pushed the Super NES to its limits with incredible 16-bit graphics, expressive sprite work, and a breathtaking soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu. Tracks like Terra's Theme and Dancing Mad became instantly iconic, perfectly complementing the story's emotional highs and lows. Critics and players alike hailed it as one of the greatest JRPGs ever made, and it solidified the Final Fantasy series as a cornerstone of the RPG genre. By the end of 1994, Final Fantasy VI had left an indelible mark on gaming, proving that video games could deliver epic stories and unforgettable experiences that rivaled movies or novels. And just like that, 1994 had delivered yet another classic, proving once again why it's remembered as one of the best years in gaming history. 8. Super Street Fighter II Turbo, the fighting game evolution. If 1994 had a fighting game king, it was still Street Fighter II. The arcade scene was alive and thriving, and Street Fighter II had already cemented itself as a cultural phenomenon. The year before, Capcom released Super Street Fighter II, adding 4 new characters and keeping the series fresh. But in 1994, they took things to another level. Enter Super Street Fighter II Turbo, a re-release that introduced a brand new, secret character, Akuma. Akuma was mysterious, powerful, and instantly legendary. He was the younger brother of Guken, and connected to Ryu and Ken. While he shared some moves with Ryu and Ken, Akuma had his own unique abilities, devastating attacks, and a dark, intimidating presence that made him a fan favorite, and a terrifying opponent in arcades. Of course, he wasn't the only villain. The iconic M. Bison and other classic fighters returned to challenge players, keeping the competition fierce. Super Street Fighter II Turbo wasn't just an arcade hit in Japan. It exploded in the US, fueling the fighting game craze that dominated 1994. 9. Street Fighter Goes Hollywood. But not quite right. With Super Street Fighter II Turbo dominating arcades and home consoles, it seemed only natural that the franchise would make the leap to the big screen. And in 1994, it did, with the live-action Street Fighter. The movie promised to bring the epic battles and iconic characters of the game to life. We had Jean-Claude Van Damme as Guile, Raul Julia as M. Bison, and a cast full of fighters fans had grown to love. But here's the catch: fans and critics weren't impressed. The movie leaned heavily on camp and over-the-top performances, straying far from the gritty, intense feel of the games. While some loved it for its fun, cheesy charm, Others felt it completely missed the mark. Storylines were confusing, character motivations were inconsistent, and the intense, strategic battles that defined the game didn't translate well to film. Still, despite its flaws, the Street Fighter movie left its mark. It was a sign of how gaming was starting to influence Hollywood, for better or worse, and it cemented 1994 as a year where video games weren't just a pastime anymore. They were a cultural force trying to break into mainstream media. So, while the movie didn't exactly hit like a Hadouken, it was an important milestone in gaming history, and a warning that not every adaptation can capture the magic of the original. 10. Earthbound. A cult classic is born 1994 also gave us one of the most unique RPGs of the era. Earthbound, known in Japan as Mother 2. Released for the Super Famicom, the game follows a young boy named Ness, joined by his friends Paula, Jeff, and Pooh. Together, they journey across a quirky, colorful world to collect melodies from 8 mysterious sanctuaries, all to stop the universal cosmic threat Gigas. With its modern-day setting, clever humor, and emotional storytelling, Earthbound stood out from traditional fantasy RPGs. Its mix of whimsy and heart quickly earned it a devoted following in Japan, making it one of the top Super NES titles of 1994. A year later, the game finally reached North America under the name Earthbound, introducing Western audiences to its charming, offbeat world. While it wasn't a blockbuster at launch, it eventually became a cult classic, proving that Nintendo could take risks and still create timeless experiences. Earthbound was more than a game, it was a statement. 1994 wasn't just about platformers or fighting games, it was also a year where RPGs could shine, capturing hearts and imagination in ways that would echo for decades. 11. Tekken. Fighting games go 3D. While Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat dominated the 2D arcade scene, and Virtua Fighter was pioneering early 3D combat, 1994 saw the arrival of a new force in fighting games, Tekken. Released by Namco in Japan, Tekken took arcade fighting to a whole new level. Unlike its predecessors, it fully embraced 3D graphics, offering fluid animations, realistic character models, and dynamic arenas that made battles feel more immersive than ever. Players could step into the shoes of legendary characters like Kazuya Mishima, his ruthless father Heihachi Mishima, Nina Williams, Paul Phoenix, Armor King, and more, each with unique moves and fighting styles. Tekken wasn't just a game, it was Namco proving they could innovate beyond classics like Pac-Man, entering the competitive arcade fighting scene in a big way. Its success would set the stage for years of sequels and inspire other 3D fighters, like Soul Edge, which eventually evolved into the legendary Soul Calibur. By blending deep combat mechanics with 3D visuals, Tekken became one of Namco's biggest hits and helped define the next generation of fighting games. 1994 wasn't just about consoles and platformers, it was the year fighting games leveled up. 12. Mortal Kombat 2. Nintendo learns the power of mature gaming. 1994 wasn't just about new consoles and flashy platformers. It was also the year home consoles finally got a taste of Mortal Kombat 2. The arcade sensation Mortal Kombat 2 had dominated 1993, but fans were desperate to play it at home. On September 9, 1994, the home console version finally arrived, a day dubbed Mortal Friday. There was a lot riding on this release. When the first Mortal Kombat came to consoles, the Super NES version had been neutered, no red blood, no fatalities, and toned down violence. Players flocked to the Sega Genesis version, which kept the gore intact, and Genesis outsold the Super NES. Nintendo wasn't making that mistake again. The Super NES version of Mortal Kombat 2 included all the iconic fatalities, gory combat, and red blood, plus enhanced graphics and sound. The result? Nintendo scored a massive win. The game sold over 50 million copies in its first week, bigger than many Hollywood blockbusters at the time, and became the third top-selling Super NES game of 1994. It was also crowned Electronic Gaming Monthly's Game of the Year. More importantly, it marked a turning point for Nintendo. This was their first M-rated game that embraced mature content, proving that video games were no longer just for kids. Mortal Kombat 2 didn't just dominate fighting games on home consoles, it set the stage for the next era of mature, cinematic, and thrilling games, and paved the way for the franchise to grow even bigger in the years to come. 13. Madden NFL 95 football hits the next level. 1994 wasn't just big for video games, it was a huge year for football, too. The NFL celebrated its 75th anniversary, with the Dallas Cowboys and San Francisco 49ers dominating the NFC, while the reformed Pittsburgh Steelers were rising in the AFC. And don't forget the surprise success of the San Diego Chargers, making waves in an unforgettable season. Into that mix came Madden NFL 95, taking the franchise to new heights. This was the first version of Madden to properly represent black NFL players, correcting an issue that had persisted in earlier releases. For the first time, players' real names, numbers, and appearances were included, giving the game an unprecedented level of authenticity. Whether on the Sega Genesis or the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, Madden NFL 95 became the top-selling football game of the year, dominating sports fans' consoles and arcades alike. It wasn't just a game, it was a touchstone for realism in sports gaming, proving that Madden could evolve with the league itself and capture the excitement of the NFL like never before. 1994 was shaping up to be a year where innovation and authenticity ruled, on the console, in the arcade, and even on the virtual gridiron. 14. The birth of the Entertainment Software Association, ESA. 1994 wasn't just about consoles and blockbuster games, it was also a pivotal year for the video game industry itself. With games like Mortal Kombat becoming household names, violence in video games caught the attention of politicians. Senator Joe Lieberman famously raised concerns after seeing his son play Mortal Kombat at home, arguing that video games were becoming too realistic and potentially dangerous for children. The government was ready to step in. The message was clear: regulate yourselves, or we will do it for you. The video game industry knew self-regulation was the only way to avoid government control, and that's when the Entertainment Software Association, ESA, was born. The ESA introduced a rating system for games, modeled after the movie industry, to help parents make informed choices. E for everyone, suitable for all ages. T for teen, comparable to PG-13, for players 13 and older. M for mature, similar to R-rated films, for ages 17 and up. From that point on, stores were expected to enforce age restrictions, just like movie theaters. Kids under 17 couldn't buy M-rated games without adult supervision. This was a turning point for gaming. It showed that the industry was maturing, recognizing that its audience was no longer just children, but also teens and adults. And by taking control of its own ratings, video games avoided strict government regulation, keeping creativity alive while protecting younger players. 1994 wasn't just the year of amazing games, it was the year gaming grew up. 15. Sega releases the 32X, a misstep in the console wars. While the Sega Saturn was launching in Japan, Sega also tried to give players a sneak peek of next-generation gaming with the Sega 32X. The 32X was an add-on for the Sega Genesis that allowed 16-bit owners to play 32-bit 3D games, essentially letting players experience next-gen graphics without buying a whole new system. On paper, it sounded brilliant. Players could get a taste of the future while still using their existing Genesis. But in practice, it didn't work out. Sega was spreading itself too thin, focusing on hardware add-ons rather than strong software support. Few quality games were released, and the system confused consumers more than it excited them. The 32X ended up backfiring, marking the start of a decline for Sega in the home console market. What was meant to be a bridge to the future became a cautionary tale, a reminder that flashy hardware alone can't save a struggling platform. In hindsight, 1994 gave Sega a glimpse of both innovation and miscalculation. The 32X would be remembered not as a triumph, but as the beginning of the end for Sega's dominance in home consoles. And that was 1994, a year where the video game world truly came of age. It was the year Sony shook up the industry with the launch of the PlayStation, bringing 3D graphics, CD quality sound, and a new era of gaming. Meanwhile, Sega and Nintendo kept battling it out, from the flashy new Sega Saturn and 32X to Donkey Kong Country and Super Metroid, proving that 16-bit consoles still had plenty of life left. Arcade fans had plenty to cheer about too, with Tekken taking 3D fighting to the next level and Super Street Fighter II Turbo keeping the classic rivalries alive, even inspiring a live-action Street Fighter movie, for better or worse. Meanwhile, Mortal Kombat 2 brought intense, mature combat to home consoles, teaching Nintendo that games weren't just for kids anymore. On the RPG front, titles like Final Fantasy VI and Earthbound pushed storytelling, exploration, and emotion to heights previously unseen on the Super NES. Sports fans weren't left out either. Madden NFL 95 set a new standard for realism, while the biggest NFL stars dominated both real fields and virtual ones. And behind the scenes, the birth of the Entertainment Software Association, ESA, gave the industry its first self-regulated rating system, proving that gaming could grow up responsibly, keeping creativity alive while protecting younger players. 1994 wasn't just a year of great games. It was a turning point, a year of innovation, rivalry, and risk-taking that shaped the future of consoles, arcades, and storytelling in gaming. From the birth of the PlayStation to the highs of Donkey Kong and Tekken, to the lessons learned from missteps like the Sega 32X, this was a year that proved video games were more than a hobby, they were a cultural force. So, whether you were a kid playing Super Metroid after school, an arcade warrior mastering Tekken combos, or a teen glued to Earthbound, 1994 was unforgettable, a milestone that continues to influence gaming even today. Because when it comes to the history of video games, 1994 truly changed everything. In our next video, we go through 1995, the year the PlayStation finally came to North America, and the launch of E3. If you like these videos, please hit the like button, and with that I will see you soon for now.